Many people believe the worst things American soldiers did in Vietnam happened during combat. But some of the darkest crimes happened far away from the battlefield, where the victims were women with no weapons and nowhere to run. What followed were acts so brutal that they stayed buried for years before the truth finally came out. The United States increased its involvement in the Vietnam War in 1965 by sending its first large waves of combat troops into South Vietnam. Thousands of American soldiers landed in places like Da Nang, Chu Lai, and Bien Hao, where huge military bases were quickly built. Within just a few months, quiet farming villages that had existed for generations were transformed into busy military zones filled with jeeps, helicopters, trucks, supply depots, and thousands of young American men serving far from home. As soon as American bases were established, local economies began forming around them almost overnight. Businesses opened to serve the thousands of American soldiers arriving every week. Bars, clubs, restaurants, and brothels appeared near almost every major American installation. Outside the base at An Ke, soldiers nicknamed one entertainment district Sin City because of its nightlife. In Saigon, a street called Tu Do became famous for its bright neon lights, crowded bars, and women who worked there entertaining foreign soldiers. Many American soldiers used the slang term "boom boom girls" to describe the women working in these bars and clubs. South Vietnamese government estimates from the mid-1960s suggested that over the course of the war, hundreds of thousands of women became involved in this trade in one way or another. Even the most conservative estimates placed the number well above 100,000 women. Most of these women were not there because they freely chose that life in any meaningful sense. Vietnam's economy had already been devastated by decades of almost continuous war. The country had first fought a long war against French colonial rule, and then became divided between North and South Vietnam, leading to another brutal conflict. Farms had been destroyed, many families had lost their main source of income, and jobs were extremely scarce. For many women, working in a bar or near an American military base became one of the only ways to earn enough money to keep their families alive. American military commanders were fully aware that this was happening around their bases. For the most part, however, they chose not to interfere, viewing it as something soldiers did during their off-duty hours rather than a military problem. That attitude allowed an environment to grow where many Vietnamese women were increasingly treated as commodities, bought for entertainment and profit, instead of being seen as human beings. Before long, that same environment would contribute to far more serious violence on a hill outside Chu Lai. In November 1966, a 5-man patrol from the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division was operating near Hill 192, a remote area close to Chu Lai in South Vietnam. The soldiers were carrying out routine patrols through the countryside when their squad leader, Sergeant Tony Meserve, made a shocking decision. He told the men they should take a woman from a nearby village to keep them company during patrol. Late one night, the soldiers entered a village and broke into a family's house while everyone was asleep. They dragged out a 21-year-old Vietnamese woman named Phan Thi Mao along with her female cousin. The cousin managed to break free and escape into the darkness. Phan Thi Mao was not able to escape, and the soldiers forced her to go with them into the jungle. Over the next 2 days, while the patrol continued moving through the area, 4 of the 5 soldiers took turns raping Phan Thi Mao. The patrol's radio operator, Sven Eriksson, refused to take part. He repeatedly objected to what was happening and tried to stop the attacks. But Sergeant Meserve outranked him, and the other soldiers ignored his protests. By the 3rd day, the men decided to kill Phan Thi Mao so she could not report the crime after they returned to the village. They murdered her and left her body behind in the jungle before continuing their patrol. When the patrol finally returned to base, Sven Eriksson reported everything he'd witnessed to his superiors. His report led to a military investigation and eventually a court-martial. 4 of the 5 soldiers were convicted, making it one of the first known cases during the Vietnam War in which American troops were found guilty of both the sexual assault and murder of a Vietnamese civilian. Sergeant Tony Meserve was originally sentenced to life in prison. However, like the sentences given to the other convicted soldiers, his punishment was later reduced on appeal, and all of them served far less time than originally ordered. The case became much better known a few years later when journalist Daniel Lang investigated it and wrote about it for The New Yorker in 1969. 2 decades later, it inspired the 1989 film Casualties of War. But when the crime first became public during the Vietnam War, it received very little national attention. Military officials and much of the public treated it as the actions of a few rogue soldiers and an isolated incident. As later investigations and testimony would reveal, it was not. After that incident in 1967, a small reconnaissance unit from the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division, known as Tiger Force, was sent to operate across Quang Ngai and Quang Nam provinces in South Vietnam. Reconnaissance units were supposed to move ahead of larger forces, gather intelligence, and track down North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong fighters believed to be hiding in the countryside. The mission was dangerous because the enemy often blended into villages and farming communities, making it difficult to tell civilians apart from combatants. Over the course of several months, however, members of Tiger Force went far beyond their military mission. According to later investigations, the unit killed large numbers of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly people. Survivors interviewed decades later described soldiers shooting women who posed no threat at all, simply because they happened to be in villages that were suspected of helping the enemy. Many of the victims had no weapons and were not involved in the fighting. At the time, almost none of these events became public. During the war, the allegations remained hidden inside military files, and most Americans had no idea they had happened. The story stayed buried for more than 30 years. Then in 2003, the newspaper, The Toledo Blade, published a major investigative series called Buried Secrets, Brutal Truths. The investigation was based on thousands of pages of military records, official documents, and interviews with former Tiger Force soldiers, military investigators, and Vietnamese survivors. The reporting exposed what had happened, and won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting in 2004. What made the revelations even more disturbing was that the U.S. Army had already investigated Tiger Force years earlier. In the early 1970s, Army investigators spent years collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and examining allegations of war crimes committed by the unit. But despite the large amount of evidence gathered, the investigation was quietly closed in 1975 without a single criminal charge being filed. Not one member of Tiger Force was ever prosecuted for the killings. The Tiger Force case showed that this kind of violence was not limited to a few soldiers acting on their own. It suggested there were deeper problems in the way some units operated during the war and how allegations of war crimes were handled afterward. But even those revelations would soon be overshadowed by an event that became one of the darkest chapters of the entire Vietnam War. On the morning of March 16, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company, part of the U.S. Army's 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, entered a group of small farming hamlets in Quang Ngai Province, known collectively as My Lai. The soldiers had been told they would likely encounter Viet Cong fighters hiding in the area. Instead, when they arrived, they found only civilians beginning their normal daily routines. Many were cooking breakfast, caring for children, feeding livestock, or preparing to work in the rice fields. Under the command of Lieutenant William Colley, the operation quickly turned into one of the worst war crimes of the Vietnam War. Soldiers rounded up unarmed villagers, including women, children, babies, and elderly people, forcing many of them into groups. They then opened fire at close range, killing hundreds of civilians. During the massacre, several women were gang raped by groups of soldiers before being shot. Homes were deliberately set on fire, livestock were killed, and the village was left in ruins. The U.S. Army's official investigation later estimated that 347 civilians were killed. However, the memorial later built at My Lai in Vietnam lists the names of 504 victims, reflecting the much higher number recognized by Vietnamese authorities. The killing might have been even worse if not for the actions of one American helicopter crew. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. was flying a reconnaissance helicopter over the area with his crew members, Glenn Andreatta and Lawrence Colburn. From the air, they realized that American soldiers were not fighting enemy troops, but were shooting unarmed civilians. Thompson landed his helicopter directly between a group of fleeing villagers and the advancing American soldiers. He ordered his door gunner to open fire on any American troops who continued killing civilians if necessary. Thompson, Andreatta, and Colburn then helped rescue several survivors by evacuating them to safety in the helicopter, saving lives that would have almost certainly been lost. After returning from the mission, Hugh Thompson immediately reported everything he'd witnessed through military channels. Despite his report, the Army's official public account described the operation as a successful battle against enemy combatants. There was no mention that hundreds of civilians had been killed. There was no mention of the women who had been raped. Instead, My Lai was officially recorded as a military victory, and that false version of events remained the official story for more than a year. One of the men who heard those stories was Ron Ridenour, an American soldier serving in a different Army unit in Vietnam. Although he'd not been to My Lai himself, he began hearing details of the massacre from soldiers who had witnessed it or spoken directly with those involved. The stories were so disturbing that he could not ignore them. After returning to the United States, he spent months carefully gathering information, speaking with other servicemen, comparing their accounts, and trying to confirm exactly what had happened. In March 1969, Ridenour wrote a detailed letter describing everything he'd learned. Instead of giving the story to newspapers, he chose to follow official channels. He mailed the letter to 30 influential people, including members of Congress, the Secretary of Defense, senior military officials, and the Pentagon. His hope was that the U.S. military would investigate the allegations honestly and hold those responsible accountable. Ridenour's letter finally triggered an official internal Army investigation into the events at My Lai. However, the investigation moved slowly and remained almost completely hidden from the public. Most Americans still had no idea that hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians had been massacred by U.S. troops. That would finally change 8 months later, when an independent journalist uncovered the story on his own and brought it to the world's attention. His name is Seymour Hersh. He began hearing rumors that a U.S. Army officer was facing secret charges connected to the killings of civilians in Vietnam. Determined to find the truth, he tracked down Lieutenant William Cawley and interviewed him, along with other soldiers who had either taken part in the operation or knew what had happened. By comparing their accounts and gathering more evidence, Hersh gradually pieced together the full story of the massacre. In November 1969, Hersh published his investigation through a news service that distributed the story to newspapers across the United States. Within just a few days, it appeared in major newspapers nationwide and quickly became one of the biggest stories of the Vietnam War. For millions of Americans, it was the first time they learned that U.S. soldiers had been accused of deliberately killing hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The reporting became even more powerful because of photographs taken during the massacre itself. Army photographer Ronald Haberl had been present at My Lai on the day of the operation. While carrying out his duties, he photographed what he was seeing around him. His images showed piles of dead civilians lying in ditches, burned homes, and the devastating aftermath of the killings. When those photographs were published alongside Hersh's reporting, Americans were no longer reading only eyewitness accounts. They could actually see the destruction with their own eyes. The photographs shocked the country and the rest of the world. For his investigation, Seymour Hersh was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting in 1970. The growing public outrage forced the U.S. Army to take stronger action. It launched a formal investigation led by Lieutenant General William Peers, whose job was not only to determine exactly what had happened at My Lai, but also to find out how the massacre had been hidden from the public for so long. The investigation became known as the Peers Commission. After months of examining documents and interviewing witnesses, the commission released its report in 1970. It confirmed that large numbers of unarmed civilians had been deliberately killed and strongly criticized senior Army officers for failing to report the massacre accurately and for helping cover up what had happened afterward. As a result of the investigation, 26 American soldiers and officers were eventually charged with crimes connected either to the massacre itself or to the effort to conceal it. In late January and early February 1971, an anti-war organization called Vietnam Veterans Against the War organized a series of public hearings in Detroit, Michigan. The event became known as the Winter Soldier Investigation. More than 100 American veterans appeared and gave sworn testimony about what they'd seen or personally taken part in during the Vietnam War. Their statements included detailed accounts of civilians being killed, villages being destroyed, prisoners being abused, and Vietnamese women being raped or sexually assaulted. What made the hearings so powerful was that these were not accusations made by journalists, politicians, or foreign governments. They were American soldiers describing their own actions and the actions of the men who had served beside them. Many admitted that they'd witnessed crimes that had never been reported, while others spoke of how violence against Vietnamese civilians had become accepted in some units. In April 1971, Navy veteran John Kerry, who had served in Vietnam and later became a U.S. Senator and Secretary of State, referred to this testimony while speaking before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He urged Congress to confront the reality of what some American troops had done during the war, instead of pretending those incidents had never happened. At the same time, the military trials connected to the My Lai massacre were coming to an end. Although 26 soldiers and officers had originally been charged after the Army's investigation, only one was ultimately convicted. In March 1971, a military court found Lieutenant William Cawley guilty of murdering 22 unarmed Vietnamese civilians during the My Lai massacre. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. However, many Americans believed Cawley was being unfairly singled out for actions they viewed as part of the brutal reality of the Vietnam War. Others argued that he was following orders, or that higher-ranking officers should have been held responsible as well. Just a few days after the verdict, President Richard Nixon personally intervened. Instead of remaining in military prison, Cawley was ordered released and placed under house arrest at Fort Benning, Georgia, while his appeals moved through the courts. Over the next several years, his sentence was reduced more than once. In the end, Cawley only spent about 3.5 years under house arrest before being paroled in 1974. For the Vietnamese families who'd lost mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, and children at My Lai, the final punishment felt painfully small compared to the scale of the massacre. While court cases and public debates continued in the United States, another lasting consequence of the war was already unfolding across Vietnam. Throughout the conflict, relationships between American soldiers and Vietnamese women had resulted in thousands of children being born. Some of these relationships were based on love or marriage, while others began through prostitution, or were shaped by the unequal conditions created by the war. Historians estimate that between 25,000 and 30,000 children were born to Vietnamese mothers and American fathers during the conflict. These children became known as Amerasians. After the Vietnam War ended in 1975 and North Vietnam took control of the country, many of them faced extremely difficult lives. Because their fathers were American, they often stood out because of their appearance and were frequently treated as outsiders. Many Vietnamese people saw them as painful reminders of years of foreign military occupation. They often faced discrimination, bullying, limited opportunities for education and work, and social isolation. At the same time, most of their American fathers had already returned home. Many had no way of staying in contact with the mothers or children they left behind, while some never even knew they'd fathered a child. For many years, the United States did very little to help these children. In 1982, a new immigration law made it somewhat easier for Amerasians to move to the United States, but the process remained limited and helped relatively few people. A much bigger change came in 1987, when Congress passed the Amerasian Homecoming Act. The law created a clear path for Amerasian children, many of whom were now teenagers or young adults, to immigrate to the United States along with their mothers or other close family members. Between 1988 and the early 1990s, an estimated 75,000 to 80,000 people arrived in the United States through this program. For many families, that opportunity came more than a decade after the last American combat troop had left Vietnam, showing how the human consequences of the war continued long after the fighting had ended.